There's a certain kind of person who quietly watches the world instead of announcing themselves to it. They're there in the group photo, but they rarely post it. Their phone has pictures, sometimes hundreds of them, but most of them never leave the camera roll. Not because they have nothing to share, not because they're hiding, but because something in them hesitates at the idea of turning their life into a public display. And from the outside, people often misunderstand that. Friends might assume they're shy or private, or maybe even insecure about how they look. Social media has created this quiet expectation that everyone should be documenting themselves, posting their face, their moments, their lives. So when someone doesn't, it can seem unusual, like they're holding back. But the truth is, there's usually something deeper happening beneath that choice. People who rarely post photos of themselves online often experience identity a little differently than the culture around them. Psychologists sometimes describe this through something called self-concept regulation. In simple terms, it's how people manage the relationship between their internal identity and the version of themselves that exists in public. For some people, those two things blend easily. Posting photos feels natural, just another way of expressing who they are. But for others, there's a stronger boundary between the inner self and the public self. Research in behavioral psychology has found that individuals who process experiences more privately are less motivated to constantly present themselves publicly. It's not about fear of attention. It's about where their sense of self actually lives. For them, identity isn't something that needs to be broadcast to feel real, and often that pattern didn't appear randomly. It tends to grow out of environments where observation mattered more than expression. Maybe they grew up being the listener in conversations rather than the center of them. Maybe they learned early that attention could be unpredictable, or maybe their nervous system simply adapted to process the world quietly, internally. Over time, their brain became more comfortable experiencing life than documenting it. The brain's default mode network, the system linked to reflection and self-awareness, tends to be more active in people who process internally, which means their sense of self is already active, even without an audience. And none of this is better or worse than the alternative. Some people feel energized by sharing themselves publicly. Others feel more grounded keeping parts of their life unbroadcast. Both are simply different ways the human mind organizes identity and social connection. But here's the paradox. People rarely talk about. The people who post themselves the least often observe the most. They notice details in conversations others miss. They watch social dynamics closely. They read emotional shifts in rooms. Because when you're not constantly curating how you appear to others, your attention becomes available to understand the world. Of course, there's a quiet trade-off too. Sometimes their life can appear invisible to people scrolling online. Moments that felt meaningful to them never exist in the public record. But internally, those experiences are often processed more deeply. And that's why this way of moving through the world isn't a flaw. It's just a different orientation toward attention, identity, and presence. Some people experience life through expression, others through observation. If you've ever noticed yourself hesitating before posting a photo of yourself, there's a good chance nothing about that instinct is accidental. It might reveal something about how your mind relates to the world. And once you start noticing that, you may begin to recognize other quiet patterns about yourself too. But that's a different conversation.